welcome to my presentation. This is for my English 102 class, spring semester of 2020. My name is Eldon Morgill, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation. I also hope that you are home safe and healthy in your homes. Thank you very much. My presentation is on the correlation between abortion rate and crime rate in the US, and how they have what's called an inverse relationship. So what that means is the higher one thing is, the lower the other is. In this case, it'd be the higher the crime rate, the lower the abortion rate, and vice versa. The higher the abortion rate, the lower the crime rate. First thing I'd like to go over is the history of abortion. Abortion actually has a much longer history than many people realize, dating all the way back to the early 1800s. However, abortions in the 1800s and abortions now were two very different procedures. In the 1800s, you had a much higher inherent risk level with much harder access to properly medical trained staff and proper medical tools. Compared to now, you walk into a hospital or a Planned Parenthood and can get it done relatively easily. In the 1800s, that wasn't really an option, especially once we got to the 1880s when abortion was first deemed illegal here in the US. You still had about the same rate of abortions being performed, about 1.2 million per year, but now that 1.2 million, instead of being performed in a safe hospital, sterile environment by proper medically trained staff and with proper medical tools, you force these women who needed this procedure done into what are called third-party atmospheres, which are people who are now operating out of their home or a public space that is not sterile, not regulated, and the person may not have the training that is required or experience or the proper medical tools either. Many of these women were rushed to the hospital. Thousands and thousands of women were rushed to the hospital because of these third-party abortions, and they had internal bleeding, or many of them oftentimes had infections due to the difficulty of sterilizing equipment and surfaces. You also had women resorting to self-induced abortions, where they tried to perform the procedure themselves, which has a much higher risk of internal bleeding as well as infection. Now fast forward about 100 years to 1973, when abortion is now federally legalized in the US. This came from the case Roe v. Wade, as I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Roe v. Wade was a huge turning point in healthcare and federal funding for healthcare, a big win for many people, and has changed the world as we know it still today. Sadly, 3 years after Roe v. Wade, what's called the Hyde Amendment of 1976 was created, and that amended the Constitution and removed the part where it talks about federal funding for abortions and Medicaid. Now, Medicaid is something you might not be familiar with. It's different from Medicare. Medicaid is federal funding for medical procedures for people who are in low income and in poverty situations. And a high percentage of women who get abortions come from low income families and poverty stricken backgrounds. So that Medicaid funding is necessary for many of them to get these abortions done. And studies also prove that the percent of children born in low-income households are at a higher risk for violent crime than children born into wealthier and more families with more stability. So these women who normally would be getting these abortions and not having these children because they are not in a stable place in their life or financially cannot support a child are now forced either to risk their bodies as well as the bodies of their possible children and get a third party abortion performed, or a self-induced abortion, which is even higher risk, or they have to carry this baby to full term and then support it as much as they can. And many of these women, especially in low-income families, may have substance abuse problems, so the child can come out with deformities, and is also born into that high-risk category. So they are statistically more likely to commit violent crimes later in life. And that's where we see this peak in violent crime about 18 to 20 years, obviously after that child would be born. But with abortions and that child not being born, that crime is never committed, therefore you see the crime rate decrease. So now 56 million is the number of abortions carried out annually worldwide right now. And about 45% of those, or about 25,200,000 abortions, are performed in unsafe environments or are performed unsafely, meaning this is third-party atmospheres and third-party abortions, self-induced abortions, or abortions performed in areas with ill-equipped staff, poor sanitation, and that leaves much higher risk of infection and endangers the woman's body as well as her child. Now with this, the 56 million, a very high percentage of the people of this 56 million are coming from these low-income backgrounds, and it's very difficult for them to pay to get the abortion performed themselves, and they require this federal funding. And with the Hyde Amendment, it took that away. Therefore, it decreased the rate of abortions, and therefore caused a slight bump in crime rates. As we can see here, the crime rate has peaked, as you can see here, in the early 1990s. If you back up to 1970 here, right about 1973, you see when abortion was legalized, and about a 20-year jump to the early 90s here. You see this initial decrease, a massive drop in total crime, as well as you see violent crimes, the drop there, and a steady decrease as abortion continues to be legal here. Now, this is for California. So there were 5 states that legalized abortion before 1973 and before Roe v. Wade federally legalized it. Those states were California, Oregon, North Carolina, New York, and Hawaii. Those 5 states legalized abortion either in 1970 or 1971, and those 5 states all had a sharp decline in violent crime as well as regular crime a few years before the national average. Because they legalized abortion about 2 to 3 years before it was federally legalized, they experienced that same drop in crime at a very similar percentage just a few years earlier than the rest of the United States. Here you can see the U.S. violent crime rate. Back here you go to 1973 here, and you go to about another 20 years later, you have a peak in crime. You see a steady build, and then you hit 1994, or here right about 1992, 93. You have this initial decline almost exactly 20 years after those children who normally wouldn't have been born because they would have been born into very unstable environments. Now you see the fact that they were never born means those crimes were never committed, and the crime rate decreases. Now you have why abortion is necessary. So with abortion, it's not only a medical right, in my opinion, for the women to make this decision, but it also has a major effect on crime and how crime can be avoided entirely just by creating the correct situation where if a woman is pregnant and decides that she can't provide for that child and is not in a situation where she can provide enough stability for that child to grow up properly and become a functioning adult. A lot of these children, like I said, are part of the high-risk category, born into the low-income and poverty-stricken neighborhoods and backgrounds with not a lot of family support, possible substance abuse issues within their family, or develop personally themselves as well because they're around it a lot, because obviously high drug usage goes along with low-income areas and poverty-stricken areas as well. So you have a much higher number of children born without abortions in these poverty-stricken areas, therefore more children in this high-risk category, therefore more young adults who are in this high-risk area. So 14 years of age to 20 years of age is the highest risk of crime. That's where you see the most individuals incarcerated or charged with violent crimes. And now you see a massive decrease going back now to our violent total U.S. violent crime. You see a massive decline here right after abortions are legalized, or right after the 20-year mark of abortions being legalized, right when those people and would-be children would be in that high-risk category. So there's a lot less people in that category, therefore less crimes being committed. And that's about it. So thank you for your time. I hope you all are safe and well, like I said initially, and hope you have a great summer. Thank you very much.